under the cold Seattle rain, a father once forced his pregnant daughter to sign away her soul just to save his prestige. 20 years later, he's back with a $250,000 bribe, begging for a lie. He's expecting a grandson to save his legacy, but he's about to meet the daughter who never forgot his cruelty. I'm Lucy May. I'm so glad you could join me today. How is the weather treating you? I hope you're all staying warm and safe. Before we begin, please take a moment to hit that like button or share a quick hello in the comments. It truly warms my heart to connect with you. Today, we're diving into a story of a woman who was broken by her own blood, only to rise stronger than they ever imagined. Let's listen to Elena's journey. The bell above the door of Sterling Petals did not just chime. It seemed to recoil as the heavy, oppressive scent of expensive sandalwood and legal success pushed its way into my sanctuary. I did not look up immediately from the arrangement of pale pink peonies I was crafting, even as the familiar, rhythmic click of Italian leather loafers against my polished concrete floor echoed through the shop. I knew that sound. It was the sound of authority, the sound of people who owned the air they breathed and expected you to pay rent for yours. My hands, stained slightly with the green lifeblood of stems and damp earth, continued their work with a precision that belied the sudden, cold knot tightening in my stomach. At 36 years old, I had built this life in Seattle from the literal dirt, far away from the polished mahogany cages of my youth. Yet here was the past, invading my present with the subtle violence of a closing courtroom door. Still playing in the mud, I see, Elena, a voice drawled, dripping with a patronizing sweetness that made my skin crawl. I looked up then, meeting the sharp, calculating eyes of my brother, Julian. He stood there, looking entirely out of place amidst the wild ferns and blooming hydrangeas, his charcoal suit probably costing more than my shop's monthly revenue. Beside him stood the patriarch, Harrison Sterling. My father hadn't changed much in 20 years. He still carried himself like a man who was constantly presiding over a high-stakes trial, his spine a rigid line of uncompromising arrogance. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't offer an apology for the 2 decades of silence that had followed the night he threw his pregnant daughter out into a rainstorm. Instead, he simply surveyed my shop with a thin, tight smile that didn't reach his cold, gray eyes, as if he were evaluating the property for a forced liquidation. The place is charming in a rustic, desperate sort of way, Julian continued, his hand hovering over a delicate orchid as if he were contemplating whether or not to crush it. But we aren't here for the scenery, Elena. We are here because the Sterling name is currently facing a bit of a PR headwind, and it seems you might finally be of some use to the family. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced a slip of paper, laying it down on my workstation right next to a pile of discarded leaves. It was a check. I stared at it, the numbers blurring for a moment before snapping into sharp focus. $250,000. It was a staggering amount of money, a life-changing sum for someone who worked 16-hour days to keep a small business afloat. Yet to them, it was clearly just the price of a temporary inconvenience. We saw the article in the local Gazette, Harrison finally spoke, his voice a deep, gravelly resonance that used to make me tremble as a child. A feature on M. Sterling Reed, the young prodigy winning the regional debate championships and coding honors. It's a strong name, a sterling name. It's time the boy took his rightful place in the lineage, especially with our 50-year firm anniversary gala approaching next week. A hollow, bitter laugh threatened to bubble up in my throat, but I suppressed it, maintaining the silence of the abyss that I had perfected over the years. They hadn't even bothered to check. They had seen the initial M, the Sterling surname I had stubbornly kept as a mark of my own resilience, and their own desperate need for a male heir to polish their tarnished reputation did the rest of the work. They thought Maya was a boy. They thought they were buying a grandson to parade in front of 200 guests and a live-streamed audience to prove the Sterlings were a family of tradition and continuity. Julian leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive mints and ego. Think of it as a back payment for your little excursion into independence, Elena. All you have to do is show up at the gala, bring the boy, and play the part of the redeemed daughter for the cameras. $250,000 for one night of acting. It's far more than you'll ever make selling weeds to hipsters. He flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, his contempt for my life and my struggles radiating off him in waves. He truly believed that every person had a price, and that mine was sitting there on the table, signed in Harrison's bold, aggressive script. They stood there, two men who had tilled nothing but misery, waiting for me to bow to the weight of their gold. I wiped my hands on my apron, the movement slow and deliberate. I didn't reach for the check, nor did I push it away. I let it sit there, a piece of paper that represented 20 years of their cruelty and one night of their desperation. My mind raced back to the night I was 18, shivering in a bus station with nothing but a backpack and a heavy secret, while they sat in their mansion sipping scotch. They wanted a show. They wanted a legacy to save their failing firm. I looked at Harrison, then at Julian, seeing the cracks in their armor that they were too arrogant to realize I could see. My heart was thumping a steady, vengeful rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of calm, professional indifference. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice as steady as the shears on my belt. My lack of immediate gratitude seemed to annoy Julian, who shifted his weight, his eyes flickering with impatience. He expected a tearful thank you or a desperate grab for the money. He didn't expect the wall of granite I had become. Harrison narrowed his eyes, sensing perhaps for the first time that the girl he had broken 2 decades ago wasn't the woman standing before him today. The silence stretched between us, filled only with the distant hum of Seattle traffic and the ticking of the old clock on my wall. Finally, I picked up the check with 2 fingers, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy. I didn't look at the amount again. I looked directly into my father's eyes, seeing the man who had traded his daughter for a clean reputation and was now trying to buy her back for the same reason. "You want us at the ceremony?" I said, my tone flat, devoid of the emotion they were expecting. "You want the world to see the Sterling family reunited for your 50-year milestone." Harrison nodded once, a curt, regal movement. "Exactly. It's about the image, Elena. It's about the future of the firm." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my grip tightening on the slip of paper. "I understand," I whispered, the irony of the situation tasting like ash in my mouth. "But tell me one thing, Father. After 20 years of pretending I was dead, why now?" Julian did not even have the grace to look ashamed. Instead, he let out a short, dry chuckle that sounded like dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. He adjusted his silk tie, his movements brimming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never had to work for anything but his father's approval. Why now, Elena? Because the world has changed, even if your modest little lifestyle hasn't, he said, his eyes scanning the shop again with that same clinical disdain. He walked toward a display of white lilies, his voice dropping into a tone that was meant to be confidential but felt like a threat. He explained that the Sterling law firm, the pillar of Seattle's legal elite for half a century, was currently navigating a transitional period. To the outside world, that meant crisis. Rumors of mismanagement and a series of lost, high-profile cases had the board of directors restless and the legacy clients looking toward younger, more modern firms. They didn't just need a celebration for the 50th anniversary. They needed a resurrection of the Sterling myth. We need the optics of a united front, a lineage that promises continuity, Julian continued, his voice rising with a theatrical fervor that made my stomach turn. He pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his pocket, a small feature from the local community section, and smoothed it out on the counter next to the check. It was an article about the regional high school debate finals, titled "The Sharp Mind of M. Sterling Reed." My daughter Maya looked radiant in the accompanying photo, her eyes full of the same fire I had seen in Caleb's just before he smiled. But because she was wearing a structured blazer and had her hair pulled back tightly, and because Julian's mind was a closed loop of patriarchal expectations, he saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a grandson. He saw a male heir who could be groomed, polished, and presented to the shareholders as the future of the firm. A debate champion and a coder, Julian mused, tapping the photo of my daughter with a manicured fingernail. The boy has the Sterling intellect. It's a waste to let that kind of potential rot in the suburbs or behind a florist's counter. I felt a cold, jagged laugh rising in my chest, but I kept it locked behind my teeth, maintaining the silence of the abyss. The irony was so thick it was nearly suffocating. They were so blinded by their own sexism and their desperate need for a son to save their reputation that they hadn't even bothered to read the full article or check a single fact. They didn't know Maya was a girl. They didn't know she was the very embodiment of everything they had tried to crush 20 years ago. Independence, strength, and a brilliance that didn't need their permission to exist. Harrison, who had remained silent like a gargoyle watching a storm, finally stepped forward. His presence seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room. "The check is a gesture of goodwill, Elena," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "But make no mistake, this is a business arrangement. You will bring the boy to the gala at the St. James Cathedral. You will sit at the head table. You will smile when the cameras are on you, and you will let us introduce our heir to the city." He looked at me as if he were granting a pardon to a common criminal, his arrogance so absolute that the possibility of me saying no hadn't even crossed his mind. He truly believed that $250,000 was enough to erase 2 decades of abandonment, enough to buy the soul of a child he had never met. I looked down at the check again, then at the photo of Maya. My mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the impact of their own hubris. They wanted a show? I would give them a performance they would never forget. They wanted to use my child as a prop for their failing firm? I would use their gala as the stage for their final collapse. $250,000 is a lot of money for one night of acting, I said softly, mimicking the rhythm of their own cold, transactional language. Julian smirked, a look of triumph crossing his face that made him look remarkably like a snake that had just swallowed a mouse. He thought he had won. He thought the little sister had finally folded under the weight of the sterling gold. "We'll be there," I said, the words feeling like a vow. I picked up the check, folding it once and tucking it into my apron pocket without a second glance. The St. James Cathedral, next Saturday at 7 o'clock. Harrison nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned toward the door without another word, his mission accomplished. Julian followed, pausing for a moment to look back at me with a wink that felt like a physical oily stain. "Dress the boy in something expensive, Elena. First impressions are everything in this family." As the door clicked shut behind them, leaving the shop quiet once more, I stood in the center of my sanctuary, surrounded by the scent of peonies and the heavy, electric charge of a coming storm. They were walking away believing they had bought a future, never realizing they had just signed the warrant for their own public execution. The silence that followed their departure wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, vibrating with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken words. I closed my eyes, and the gentle hum of the Seattle traffic outside transformed into the relentless, drumming roar of a storm from 20 years ago. I could almost feel the phantom chill of my soaked clothes clinging to my 18-year-old skin, the way the fabric of my cheap maternity dress felt like lead against my growing belly. That night, the Sterling Library hadn't smelled like flowers. It had smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the clinical, freezing scent of a life being dismantled. My father had been sitting in his favorite wingback chair, his face a marble mask of disappointment, while Julian paced the Persian rug like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Sign it, Elena," Julian had hissed, shoving a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany desk. It wasn't just a simple eviction. It was a surgical removal of my very identity. He had drafted it himself, a masterpiece of cruelty that stripped me of the Sterling name, any claim to the family estate, and even the right to call myself Harrison's daughter. To them, I wasn't a child in trouble. I was a stain on a pristine white shirt that needed to be bleached away. My hands had been shaking so violently that I could barely hold the silver fountain pen. But Julian hadn't offered a hand of comfort. He had only watched with a smirk of triumph, knowing that by erasing me, he was securing his own path to the family throne. I remembered looking toward my father, searching for even a flicker of the man who used to tuck me in at night. But Harrison Sterling didn't look at me. He looked through me, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "You chose the grease monkey, Elena," he had said, his voice as cold as a winter grave. "You chose a life of oil and dirt over a legacy of law and honor. If you want to be a commoner, then you shall live like one." The grease monkey was Caleb, a man whose hands were often stained with engine oil, but whose heart was the only warm thing I had ever known in that house. Caleb didn't speak in legal riddles or look at people as assets to be managed. He saw me, the real me, not the Sterling heiress. The memory of his calloused, gentle thumb wiping away my tears was the only thing that gave me the strength to press that pen to the paper. I signed it all away. The trust funds, the social standing, the protection of the Sterling name. I signed it for the life growing inside me, a life I refused to let be raised in a house where love was measured in billable hours. When the final page was turned, Julian hadn't even waited for me to pack a bag. He had gripped my arm with a strength that left bruises and marched me toward the grand entrance, my small suitcase bumping against the marble stairs as if it were an intruder being escorted out. The last thing I saw before the heavy oak doors swung shut was my father's silhouette against the firelight, still sitting motionless, as if his daughter were nothing more than a closed case file. Then came the sound, a thunderous, final thud as the door slammed, locking me out of the only world I had ever known. I stood there on the wet pavement, the rain blinding me, clutching my stomach and realizing for the first time that I was truly, terrifyingly alone. That sound had lived in the back of my mind for 2 decades, a jagged echo that reminded me of my own worthlessness in their eyes. But as I opened my eyes back in the present, standing in my own shop surrounded by the scent of my own success, I realized that the echo was changing. It was no longer the sound of a door closing on me. It was the sound of a countdown beginning for them. I reached into my pocket and touched the check, the paper crisp and sharp. They thought they could buy their way back into a life they had discarded like trash. They thought they could use the child of the grease monkey to save their crumbling tower. A slow, cold smile finally touched my lips, one that would have terrified Julian if he could see it. The girl who walked into the rain 20 years ago was gone, and the woman who had survived the storm was finally ready to settle the bill. The transition from the cold marble halls of the Sterling estate to a drafty studio apartment in the industrial district didn't happen in a single heartbeat, but the reality of it hit me every morning when the smell of old grease and wet pavement replaced the scent of fresh linens and lavender. For those first few years, life was a blur of exhausting shifts and the constant, gnawing worry of how to make a single dollar stretch across 3 days of meals. Caleb was my anchor through it all, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with the dark, stubborn oil of other people's broken cars, yet he never once made me feel like I was anything less than a queen in our cramped, one-bedroom world. We didn't have a trust fund or a legal team. We had a shared dream and a relentless work ethic that my father would have never understood. I took a job at a wholesale nursery, arriving at 4 a.m. to haul heavy crates of soil and prune endless rows of roses until my fingers bled and my back felt like it would snap in two. It was back-breaking labor, the kind that the Sterlings only ever saw from the windows of their climate-controlled limousines. But every cent I earned was mine. I was learning that true value wasn't inherited. It was forged in the heat of a 16-hour workday. Then, the world shattered for a second time, leaving a hole in my heart that no amount of success could ever truly fill. Caleb was gone in a heartbeat. A freak accident at the garage, a heavy jack failing, and just like that, the only person who had ever truly loved me was taken. I was 24 years old, with a 4-year-old daughter and a bank account that barely covered the cost of a modest funeral. I remember sitting on the floor of our apartment, clutching Maya to my chest, and hearing Julian's voice in my head, mocking my excursion into independence. He probably expected me to crawl back to the estate, begging for a scrap of the Sterling fortune to keep us from the streets. But as I looked at Maya's sleeping face, seeing Caleb's quiet strength in the set of her jaw, I realized that crawling back wasn't an option. I didn't need their charity. I needed my own life. I took the small insurance payout from the accident and every penny I had hidden away in a coffee tin, and I bought a tiny, dilapidated corner shop that no one else wanted. I named it Sterling Petals. It was a name intended to be a silent, beautiful act of defiance, a way to reclaim a surname that had been used to diminish me and turn it into something that bloomed through sheer force of will. For years, I was the first person on the street every morning, sweeping the sidewalk and arranging my displays while the city was still gray and quiet. I became a student of the soil and the seasons, learning the language of flowers because they didn't lie and they didn't judge. Maya grew up in the back of that shop, doing her homework on upturned crates and learning that a woman's worth was measured by the calluses on her hands and the integrity of her word. She saw me negotiate with suppliers, fix leaky pipes, and build a reputation for quality that had nothing to do with a law degree and everything to do with honesty. We weren't just surviving. We were thriving in a way that felt more real than anything I had experienced in my father's house. I had built my own version of the American dream, one petal at a time, without a single cent of sterling blood money. Now, as the memory of my struggle settled back into the quiet corners of the shop, I felt a strange sense of completion. I walked to the back room, past the vibrant buckets of ranunculus and snapdragons, and reached under my bed for a small, weathered wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, tucked beneath a few old photographs of Caleb, was the document Julian had forced me to sign 20 years ago, the one that said I was no longer a part of their world. I ran my fingers over the sharp, aggressive lines of my father's signature, feeling the coldness of it even now. They thought this paper was a shield that protected their precious legacy from my shame, but they were wrong. To me, it was a receipt. It was the proof of exactly what they were willing to throw away for the sake of an image. I tucked the paper into the pocket of my apron, right next to the $250,000 check. The Sterling men wanted to play a game of appearances, and they had handed me the very weapon I needed to end it. The bell chimed again, but this time the sound didn't feel like a gunshot. It was a hesitant, fluttering tinkle that mirrored the woman who stepped through the door. My mother, Diane Sterling, stood there, looking like a delicate porcelain doll that had been left in a drafty room for too long. She was draped in a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than my delivery van, her gloved hands clutching a small leather purse with a white-knuckled grip. She looked around the shop, her eyes lingering on the Sterling Petals sign behind the counter, with a bittersweet expression that I couldn't quite name. For years, I had received anonymous orders for the most expensive arrangements in the shop, always delivered to a sterile office building downtown, never to the estate. I had always suspected it was her, a quiet, cowardly way of supporting the daughter she wasn't allowed to acknowledge. It was the quintessential act of a woman from a generation taught to keep the peace at the cost of their own soul, a silent rebellion that never quite broke the surface. "It's a beautiful shop, Elena," she whispered, her voice thin and fragile like dry parchment. She didn't move toward me, as if an invisible line still existed between us, a boundary drawn in ink and rain 20 years ago. I stood my ground, my hands resting on the cool surface of the wooden counter, feeling the weight of the document and the check in my pocket. I didn't offer her a chair, and I didn't offer her tea. The time for those small domestic comforts had passed when she watched her husband and son drag me toward the door and said nothing. I saw the way her gaze shifted to the workstation, perhaps looking for the grandson she had been told about, the boy Julian was so eager to parade. A wave of pity washed over me, not for the mother who had abandoned me, but for the woman who still lived under Harrison's suffocating shadow, still playing the role of the dutiful, silent wife while her world crumbled around her. She stepped closer, her perfume, a heavy floral scent that smelled like old money and funeral parlors, filling the space between us. "Julian told me," she said, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected Harrison to burst in at any moment. "He told me about the check and the gala. Elena, you have to listen to me. You shouldn't come. You should take that money, take your child, and leave Seattle tonight." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope, sliding it across the counter with a trembling hand. "There is $50,000 in here. It's my own money, from my mother's inheritance. Harrison doesn't know. Take it and go. If you show up at that cathedral and if they find out Maya isn't a boy, your father will make it his life's mission to destroy you. He won't just be angry. He will be humiliated in front of the entire city. He will never forgive that." I looked at the envelope, then back at the woman who had spent 40 years being afraid of a man's temper. The silent generation had raised her to be a protector of the family's image, but in her own warped, terrified way, she was trying to protect me. She thought she was offering me a lifeline, a way to escape the impending storm. But she didn't realize that I was the one who had invited the clouds to gather. She saw Maya as a liability, a mistake that would trigger Harrison's wrath, while I saw my daughter as the truth that would finally set us all free from the sterling lies. The irony was almost physical. My mother was offering me more money to stay a ghost, just as my father had offered me money to become a puppet. Neither of them could conceive of a world where I simply stood as a woman, proud of what I had built and who I had become. "I'm not running, Mother," I said, carrying the strength of 20 years of survival. I didn't touch the envelope. "For 2 decades, I lived in the shadows because you and Father were ashamed of my choices. I worked 16 hours a day to make sure Maya never had to feel the coldness of that house." I leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes, forcing her to see the person she had helped discard. "Julian is the one who saw what he wanted to see. He saw a boy because his ego couldn't imagine anything else. I am simply bringing my child to her grandfather's anniversary. If the truth humiliates him, that is a burden he created himself." Diane's face paled, and she took a small, stumbling step back, her hand flying to her throat. "He will ruin you, Elena. He has friends in the city council, in the banks. He will find a way to take this shop, to make sure you never work in this town again." She was pleading now, her voice cracking with the desperation that was painful to witness. She was so used to Harrison's power being absolute that she couldn't imagine a scenario where he didn't win. But she didn't know about the legal papers in my pocket, or the silent ally I had in the legal archives of Caleb's old friend. She didn't know that the Sterling Petals wasn't just a shop. It was a fortress I had built with my own sweat and blood. "Let him try," I replied, as a winter frost. I have survived a winter in a bus station with a baby and no coat. I have survived the death of the only man who ever loved me. Do you really think a few lawyers and a public scandal can break me now? I picked up the envelope of cash and handed it back to her, my fingers brushing against hers, for the first time in 20 years. Her skin was like ice. Keep your money, Mother. Use it to find a place of your own when the sterling name finally burns to the ground. Because next Saturday, I'm not coming to the cathedral to be redeemed. I'm coming to tell the truth. As she turned and fled the shop, her expensive coat fluttering like a broken wing, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. The last bridge to my old life had been offered, and I had burned it myself. After my mother fled, the air in the shop felt thin, as if she had taken the last of the oxygen with her. I walked back to the small office area, my movements heavy with a sudden, suffocating realization. I reached for the weathered wooden box again, but this time, I didn't just look at the top layer of photos. I felt along the bottom, pressing against the velvet lining until I heard the faint metallic click of a hidden latch Caleb had built for me years ago. He had told me once, with a sad, knowing smile, that some things were too precious to be left in the open. Inside the narrow compartment lay a bundle of envelopes, tied together with a piece of oil-stained twine. I had carried them for 20 years, too afraid to read the full truth. But the visit from my family had finally given me the cold courage I needed. As I untied the knot, the first thing I saw wasn't a love letter, but the sharp, oppressive letterhead of the Sterling law firm. These weren't letters Caleb had sent to me. They were the copies of the letters he had tried to send, returned to him unopened, along with the cease and desist orders Julian had drafted. My brother hadn't just stood by while I was kicked out. He had spent months systematically dismantling any bridge Caleb tried to build back to me. While I was sitting in that drafty apartment, wondering why the man I loved hadn't come for me sooner, Julian was using the full, terrifying weight of the family's legal empire to threaten a 20-year-old mechanic with prison and ruin. Mr. Reed, one letter began, Julian's signature a jagged, arrogant slash across the bottom of the page. Any further attempt to contact my sister will be treated as criminal harassment. We have already prepared a civil suit that will ensure you never own so much as a wrench in this state again. You are a footnote in her life, a mistake we are currently erasing. Do not test the reach of this firm. I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest, worse than the rain of 20 years ago. Caleb had never told me. He had taken the threats, the fear, and the legal bullying all on his own, just to protect me from the shame of knowing what my brother was truly capable of. He had fought for us in the dark, while I had been blinded by my own grief. I looked at the dates on the letters. Julian had been sending these for months, even after Maya was born. He didn't just want me gone, he wanted me isolated. He wanted to ensure that the Sterling name remained pure by ensuring I had no support system to turn to. He hadn't just taken away the Sterling name. He had taken away the months of peace and security Caleb and I could have had together before the accident. The silence of the abyss that I had cultivated for 2 decades wasn't just a shield anymore. It was a weapon. I realized that my brother wasn't just an arrogant lawyer. He was a thief who had stolen time and memories that I could never get back. The indignation that rose in me wasn't hot or loud. It was a freezing, crystalline clarity. I walked to the back of the shop where my private quarters were and opened the closet. Hanging there, protected by a plastic garment bag, was a dress I had bought months ago for a high-end charity gala I had never intended to attend. It was a floor-length gown of midnight black silk, simple, elegant, and devastatingly expensive. A gift to myself for a milestone I had reached in my business. I ran my hand over the cool fabric. It wasn't a party dress anymore. It was a shroud for the sterling reputation. I thought about Harrison and Julian, currently sitting in their mahogany offices, congratulating themselves on how easily they had bought me for $250,000. They thought I was coming to the St. James Cathedral to be their prop, to stand in the light and help them lie to the world. They had no idea that I was bringing the ghosts of every letter they had blocked, every threat they had made, and every tear I had cried in that bus station 20 years ago. I wouldn't need to scream or cry. I would simply let the truth speak for itself, and I would do it while wearing the color of their ending. As I zipped the garment bag shut, the sound was sharp and final, like the cocking of a hammer. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Not the girl who had been broken by a door slamming in the rain, but the woman who was about to walk through the front doors of their cathedral and burn the house down with a single sheet of paper. The countdown had truly begun. Tomorrow, the world would see the Sterling family for exactly what they were, and I would finally be the one to close the door. The night air in Seattle was thick with the scent of damp pavement and the lingering fragrance of crushed jasmine as I sat in the cramped back office of my shop. I wasn't arranging bouquets anymore. I was arranging a downfall. On the desk before me lay the weathered wooden box, but next to it sat a sleek, modern tablet and several notarized copies of the document that had once been my death warrant. The Notice of Termination of Parental Rights and Inheritance. I had reached out to Thomas, an old friend of Caleb's who had spent the last 20 years climbing the legal ladder without the benefit of a sterling-sized silver spoon. He was a man who understood that justice wasn't just about the law, but about the leverage you held in the shadows. Over an encrypted video call, we went through every line of the document Harrison and Julian had forced me to sign. Thomas's voice was a low, steady baritone through the speakers, providing the kind of intellectual satisfaction that comes from seeing a predator's trap finally turned against them. They didn't just disown you, Elena, Thomas had noted, his eyes scanning the digital copy with the clinical precision of a surgeon. They legally declared you a non-entity in the eyes of the Sterling estate. For them to use you and Maya for a public-facing campaign now, after this document was filed, is more than just hypocrisy. It's a massive liability for a firm built on the sanctity of legacy. I listened with the focus of a strategist, my mind cataloging every legal loophole and every potential countermove. This was the ASMR for the brain, the cold, hard logic of retribution. While Harrison and Julian were busy rehearsing their speeches about tradition and continuity, I was preparing the receipts that would prove their tradition was one of cruelty and their continuity was a fabrication. To pull this off, I had to play the part of the invisible observer. By day, I remained the quiet, seemingly defeated florist who had been bought for $250,000. I had even sent Julian a brief, submissive email confirming our attendance, letting him believe his arrogance had finally broken me. I let him think I was grateful for the back payment for my independence, all while I was refining a plan that relied on their own greatest weakness, their absolute certainty that they were the smartest men in the room. "Are we ready, Mom?" The voice came from the doorway, and I looked up to see Maya. She was 19 years old, possessing a poise that made me feel both ancient and incredibly proud. She wasn't the grandson Harrison was expecting. She was a woman who had spent her youth winning debate titles by finding the fatal flaw in every opponent's argument. She walked over and looked at the document on the screen, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The same smile Caleb used to give me when he finally figured out a particularly stubborn engine. I had explained everything to her, from the night in the rain to the letters Julian had used to bully her father. Maya didn't want the sterling money. She wanted the sterling truth. "They think they're introducing their heir to the city," she said, her voice clear and sharp as a diamond. "They don't realize they're actually introducing the reason their firm is going to go bankrupt." We spent the next hour rehearsing her appearance, a choreography of quiet defiance. I taught her how to walk with the elegance they expected, but with the underlying steel they couldn't anticipate. We went over the specific moment she would step into the light, ensuring the cameras would capture not a boy, but the very image of the daughter they had discarded 20 years ago. Silence was our most powerful weapon, the silence of the abyss that would make the eventual revelation all the more devastating. We weren't just going to a party. We were going to a war, and Maya was my finest soldier. I looked at her, standing there in the dim light of the back office, and for a moment, I saw Caleb standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of the pride that Julian had tried so hard to steal. "When we walk onto that stage," I told her, my voice dropping to a whisper, "do not look at the cameras. Do not look at the guests. Look only at your grandfather. Watch the moment the light leaves his eyes when he realizes he can't buy his way out of this one." As the clock on the wall ticked past midnight, I folded the original disownment paper and placed it into a slim black clutch bag, along with the $250,000 check and the copies of Julian's coercive letters. This was my arsenal. The St. James Cathedral was one of the most prestigious venues in Seattle, a place of stained glass and echoing whispers, perfectly suited for a public exorcism. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my heart, a feeling I hadn't known since the day I first opened the doors of Sterling Petals. Harrison Sterling had once told me that I had chosen a life of oil and dirt. He was right. I had tilled the soil, I had weathered the storms, and now it was time for the harvest. The trap was set. The evidence was airtight, and my M. Sterling Reed was ready to take the stage. All that was left was to wait for the curtain to rise. I can feel the tension building up, can't you? Elena is stepping into the lion's den with nothing but her truth. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Would you take the money and run? Or stay and fight for your dignity? Let me know in the comments below. And by the way, how is everyone's day going? I hope you're taking a moment for yourselves. Don't forget to like this video if you're rooting for Elena. The St. James Cathedral was a monument to the kind of power that did not just command respect, it demanded it. Its Gothic arches reaching toward the Seattle sky like the cold, grasping fingers of the legal elite. As Maya and I stepped out of the car, the air was crisp, smelling of salt from the sound and the faint, metallic scent of a city that never truly slept. I smoothed the fabric of my midnight black silk gown, feeling the weight of the legal documents tucked into my clutch like a hidden dagger. Inside, The cathedral was transformed into a theater of calculated vanity, the ancient stone walls bathed in the warm, artificial glow of high-end lighting designed specifically for the cameras. Thick black cables snaked across the marble floors, leading to a battery of live streaming equipment that would broadcast this carefully curated lie to thousands of viewers across the country. It was a masterpiece of optics, a term Julian loved because it prioritized the way things looked over the way they actually were. I watched from the shadows near the entrance as the city's power players, judges, politicians, and wealthy donors mingled over glasses of vintage champagne, their laughter echoing hollowly against the stained glass. At the far end of the nave, a grand podium had been erected, draped in the sterling law firm's crest. Harrison stood behind it, looking every bit the venerable patriarch, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights as he practiced his statesmanlike smile. Beside him, Julian was a flurry of nervous, triumphant energy, checking his gold watch and whispering into the ear of a production assistant. To anyone else, they looked like the pinnacle of American success, a family built on the bedrock of tradition, tolerance, and love. But as I stood there, an invisible observer in the very house of God, I felt a wave of nausea at the sheer hypocrisy of the scene. This was the man who had traded his daughter's safety for a clean reputation, now standing in a cathedral to lecture the world on family values. The irony was almost unbearable. They were using a sacred space to perform a profane act of deception, and the audience was eating it up with a hunger that only confirmed their own superficiality. The ceremony began with a flourish of trumpets that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, signaling the start of the live stream. Harrison took the stage, his voice booming through the cathedral's acoustics with a practiced, gravelly resonance that spoke of 50 years of legal dominance. He spoke of the sterling legacy, weaving a narrative of a family that had weathered every storm through unwavering unity and moral fortitude. He spoke of stewardship and the sacred duty of passing the torch to the next generation, his words dripping with a fake humility that made my skin crawl. Every time he mentioned family, Julian would nod solemnly from the wings, his face a mask of practiced devotion that masked his predatory greed. They were at the height of their self-satisfaction, basking in the glow of a narrative they thought they had bought and paid for with a $250,000 check. I gripped Maya's hand, feeling the steady, cool strength in her fingers. She stood beside me, a silent testament to 20 years of struggle and truth, her own black dress a sharp contrast to the opulent gold and white of the cathedral. We were the glitch in their perfect broadcast, the truth that they had tried to erase but were now inadvertently inviting onto their biggest stage. Harrison reached the climax of his speech, his chest swelling with the pride of a man who believed he had finally won. He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes bright with the thrill of the showdown he thought he was controlling. The tension in the room was palpable, a collective breath held in anticipation of the grand reveal. And now, Harrison's voice rang out, filled with a triumphant, regal authority that echoed into the furthest corners of the cathedral. It is my distinct honor to introduce the future of our legacy. Please join me in welcoming back my daughter, Elena, and the grandson who will carry the sterling name into the next half-century. He gestured toward the side entrance with a flourish, his face split in a wide, predatory grin of victory. The cameras swung around, their red lights glowing like the eyes of hungry wolves, ready to capture the prodigy they had been promised. Julian leaned forward, his hands gripped tight, waiting for the boy he thought he had purchased to validate his existence. I took a deep breath, the silence of the abyss finally breaking into a cold, focused fire, and stepped out from the shadows into the blinding white light of the stage. The rhythmic click of our heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the sudden, vacuum-like silence that swallowed the St. James Cathedral. As Maya and I stepped onto the elevated stage, moving through the blinding glare of the spotlights, the collective gasp of 200 guests rippled through the pews like a physical wave. I could see the confusion etched onto the faces of the city's legal elite, their eyes darting between the radiant, dark-haired young woman at my side and the frozen, triumphant mask on my father's face. There was no grandson. There was no male heir to carry the sterling sword into the next generation. There was only Maya, standing with a poise that made the cathedral's ancient stone look fragile, her presence a silent, devastating rebuttal to every word Harrison had just spoken. Julian's hand, which had been raised in a celebratory gesture, slowly sank to his side, his face draining of color until it matched the white lilies on the altar. I did not wait for an invitation to speak. I walked directly to the podium, my movements fluid and deliberate, the silence of the abyss finally giving way to a voice that was as clear and cold as a winter morning. I didn't look at the audience. I looked directly into the camera lens, knowing that my image was being beamed into thousands of homes, a digital ghost returning to haunt the house that had discarded it. "Good evening," I said, the word resonating through the cathedral's acoustics. "My father just spoke to you about tradition, tolerance, and the sacred bond of the Sterling family. He invited you here to witness a reunion, to celebrate a legacy that he claims is built on unwavering unity." I paused, letting the irony of my black dress, the color of a funeral, sink into the minds of everyone watching. Harrison stepped toward me, his voice a frantic, low-frequency hiss that didn't carry to the microphones. "Helena, what are you doing? Think about the boy. Think about the arrangement." He was still trapped in his own lie, his mind unable to bridge the gap between his expectations and the reality standing before him. I ignored him, reaching into my black clutch bag with the precision of a strategist. I pulled out the original Notice of Termination of Parental Rights and Inheritance, the very paper Julian had forced me to sign in the rain 20 years ago, and held it up so the high-definition cameras could capture every sharp, cruel line of my father's signature. "This is the real Sterling tradition," I said, my voice never wavering as I projected a calm, professional indifference. 20 years ago, Harrison and Julian Sterling used their legal expertise to strip away the rights of an 18-year-old girl because she chose love over their brand of social standing. They signed this document to ensure I was legally dead to them, to make sure no Sterling blood money would ever touch the child of a common mechanic. They spent 2 decades pretending I didn't exist and ensuring my daughter and I lived in the shadows. A shocked murmur erupted from the pews, but I didn't stop. I was the invisible observer no longer. I was the strategist delivering the final blow. I reached back into my bag and produced the $250,000 check, the back payment Julian had so arrogantly offered me to play the part of the redeemed daughter. I held it between 2 fingers, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft of the cathedral. Last week, When they realized their firm was failing and their reputation was in tatters, they came to my flower shop. Not to apologize, not to meet their granddaughter. They came to buy a lie. They offered me this, $250,000 to stand here tonight and pretend that they are men of honor. They were so blinded by their own sexism that they assumed M. Sterling Reed was a boy, because in their world, only a grandson is worth the price of a bribe. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press down on Harrison's shoulders until his spine finally began to bend. Julian looked toward the back of the room, perhaps searching for a way to cut the live stream, but it was far too late. The truth had already been launched into the world, an irreversible arrow of justice. Harrison's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The great orator had been silenced by his own history. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw only a small, terrified man clinging to the wreckage of a name that no longer meant anything. "I didn't come here for your money, Father," I whispered, my voice carrying to every corner of the room through the open microchip. "I came to return it." I turned to Maya, who was watching the scene with a cold, intellectual satisfaction that would have made her father proud. "And I came to show you that the legacy you were so desperate to buy is something you will never deserve." The silence that followed my departure from the podium was not the respectful hush of a sanctuary, but the suffocating static of a ruined reputation. Behind me, the cathedral erupted into a frantic, disjointed chaos as Julian finally lunged for the production desk, screaming at the technicians to cut the feed. But the damage was already done. The truth had been launched into the digital ether beyond the reach of his legal threats or his father's influence. I did not look back as I reached the edge of the stage, but I could hear the sharp, rhythmic notifications of 100 cell phones, the sound of shareholders and legacy clients receiving the news and beginning the immediate process of withdrawing their support. The Sterling law firm, a tower built on 5 decades of arrogance and exclusion, was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own hypocrisy, the dominoes falling one by one in the cold light of the live stream. Harrison remained frozen, his face the color of wet ash, looking less like a titan of the law and more like a crumbling statue of a forgotten era. As we reached the center aisle, a sudden movement caught my eye. My mother, Diane, stood up from the front row, her porcelain mask finally shattered. For a moment, I expected her to shrink back into the shadows of Harrison's legacy, but instead, she stepped into the aisle, her chin trembling, but her eyes fixed on mine. Without a word to the man she had feared for 40 years, she reached out and took my other hand, her gloved fingers gripping mine with a strength I did not know she possessed, publicly choosing her daughter over the Sterling name. Together, the 3 of us walked toward the heavy oak doors, our path lit by the flickering camera flashes of the very press Harrison had invited to document his triumph. Behind us, on the dark marble floor of the stage, lay the 4 shredded pieces of the $250,000 check, looking like nothing more than discarded trash in a house of God. The heavy doors of the St. James Cathedral swung open, and the cool, damp Seattle air rushed in to meet us, tasting sweeter than any air I had breathed in 20 years. As we stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights shimmering against the wet pavement, I felt a profound sense of a deep, soul-level peace that came from knowing the burden of the past had finally been laid to rest. There was no anger left in my heart, only the quiet, intellectual satisfaction of a debt settled and a truth told. I led Maya toward our car, leaving the shouting, the cameras, and the collapsing empire of the Sterling men behind us in the darkness. We were not just leaving a building. We were walking out of a prison we had outgrown a lifetime ago. And for the first time since that night in the rain, I felt like the air truly belonged to me. The Seattle spring arrived with a softness that felt like a quiet apology from the heavens. 6 months had passed since the night at the St. James Cathedral, and the world looked remarkably different from the window of Sterling Petals. The scandal that had toppled the Sterling law firm was no longer the headline. It had been replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of a life built on honesty. My shop was busier than ever, but the people who filled it weren't looking for a story or a glimpse of the woman from the live stream. They came because they recognized the integrity in every stem and the truth in every bloom. We didn't need a public relations firm or a massive advertising budget. Our reputation was rooted in the dirt of hard work and the light of authenticity. I had realized that the real value of my life didn't reside in the Sterling surname or a mahogany office, but in the beauty I had created with my own 2 hands. I looked over at the workbench where my mother, Diane, was carefully trimming the thorns from a dozen long-stemmed red roses. She had moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment 3 blocks away, far from the suffocating mahogany shadows of the estate. She didn't wear her heavy wool coats anymore. She wore a simple linen apron and a pair of comfortable gardening shoes. As she hummed a soft tune while misting the ferns, I saw a light in her eyes that had been missing for 40 years. We worked in a comfortable, healing silence, our hands moving in sync as we nurtured the flowers. She was no longer the silent protector of a man's fragile ego. She was a woman who had finally learned to nurture her own peace. The Sterling firm had collapsed under the weight of its own lies, but in the wreckage, we had found something much more durable. Maya was preparing to leave for her freshman year at the university, her bags already packed with the same quiet determination that had fueled her debate victories. She had become the face of a new kind of legacy, one that valued character over clout and resilience over an inheritance. She walked over to me as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Seattle skyline, casting a golden glow over the shop. She leaned against the counter, watching me finish a bridal bouquet. "Mom," she asked, her voice soft but curious, "do you ever regret it? After all the chaos and the things they tried to do you ever wish we had just stayed quiet and taken the $250,000? I set the flowers down and looked at her, seeing Caleb's strength and my own hard-won peace reflected in her eyes. I reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, my heart feeling full and light in a way I hadn't thought possible 20 years ago. I thought about the bus station, the 16-hour shifts, and the long nights of wondering if I would ever be enough. Then I looked at the shop, at my mother's smiling face, and at the incredible woman my daughter had become. I smile, a slow, genuine expression of contentment that reached my eyes. "Not for a single second, Maya," I replied, my voice steady and certain. "The money would have just been another cage. By telling the truth, we didn't just win. We became free." And for the first time in my life, I can truly say that I am home. Wow, what a journey with Elena. Listening to this, I couldn't help but feel a lump in my throat when she stood on that stage. It takes so much courage to face the people who broke you, not with anger, but with the cold, hard truth. I'm so proud of her for choosing her dignity over that check. This story reminds us that our value isn't defined by the names we carry or the money in our bank accounts. It's built through our resilience and our honesty. Sometimes, the best way to heal is to stop running and finally let the light shine on the dark corners of our past. To all the women out there building your own flower shops from scratch, you are the true matriarchs. What did you think of Elena's choice? Was there a moment that stood out to you? For me, it was seeing her walk away with Maya, leaving the chaos behind. I'd love to hear your thoughts and the lessons you took from this. Please share them in the comments below. Thank you for spending this time with me at Rose Revenge. I'm Lucy May, and I'll see you in the next story. Stay strong and be kind to yourselves.